All right, so over the last few weeks, I've kind of found myself thinking quite a bit about the Catholic and Orthodox understanding of sacred tradition. And if you've been following this channel as of late, then you've probably noticed that I've done about 2 videos on this topic recently. Now, the goal of those videos hasn't really been to simply rehash every single argument for sola scriptura, or even to repeat all of the usual Protestant objections that Catholics and Orthodox have already heard 1,000 times before. I really wasn't interested in doing that. And it's not because those objections are necessarily bad. I don't want you to come away with that impression. I think they're quite good. It's just that really wasn't what I was trying to do. Rather, my goal has simply been to help my Catholic and Orthodox friends at least understand why Protestants continue to wrestle with these kinds of issues in the first place. And so what I've intentionally tried to do throughout these videos is just to continue to grant the strongest version of the Catholic and Orthodox position just for the sake of argument. You see, in these videos, I'm not really asking whether or not the apostles taught things orally. Of course they did. I'm not asking whether or not the Christians passed down teachings from one generation to the next. Again, of course they did. And also, I'm not even asking whether or not the Catholic or Orthodox version of sacred tradition exists. Remember, I've actually been granting that claim for the sake of argument because I wanted us to focus on some of the other questions that I feel don't exactly get nearly enough attention as they deserve. And so in the first video, what I asked my Catholic and Orthodox friends was a fairly simple question. I asked them, if sacred tradition eventually gets written down in things like councils and creeds and catechisms and dogmatic definitions and official church documents, then what functionally distinguishes it from sacred scripture? After all, both are said to have originated with the apostles. Both are said to have communicated divine truth. Both are said to be infallible. Both are said to be binding upon the conscience. And eventually, as we later see, both end up preserved in written form. And so my question to them was, well, at that point, what is the meaningful functional, and that's the key word there, functional difference between the two? And so that was the question that I posed to my Catholic and Orthodox friends in the first video. Now, in the second video, I asked a slightly different question. You see, in that video, I asked them, if sacred tradition exists today, and again, I'm still granting everything that I granted in the first video, then where exactly can I find its contents? Like, where can I go to actually locate it today? And I kind of thought that this was a very important question because, if I wanted to know what Paul taught, for example, to the Galatians, well, I can simply open Paul's letter to the Galatians. Simple as that. If I wanted to know what Peter taught concerning suffering, I can simply open 1 Peter. If I wanted to know what John taught about Christ, then I can simply open the Gospel of John. Do you see my point? However, my point was that if I wanted to do the same thing with something that's taught in sacred tradition, then where would I go? How would I know what's within the confines of sacred tradition and what isn't? And more importantly, how does the ordinary Christian identify what belongs to sacred tradition before, and that's the key word there, before the church convenes a council and eventually goes on to clarify it? Now, if I'm being honest, I think both of those questions are vitally important for the sake of getting clarity in these types of discussions. And although I still haven't really heard answers that I find particularly satisfying, the more I've thought about them, the more I've kind of realized that they both seem to point to a much larger issue that I want to deal with in this video. Now, before I start unpacking that larger issue, I actually want to begin by stillmanning what exactly Catholics and Orthodox believe about sacred tradition, because I want to ensure that nobody misunderstands me or thinks that I'm, intentionally misunderstanding the Catholic and Orthodox position. Again, whenever you caricature somebody else's position, nobody wins, right? So we certainly don't want to do that. You see, when Catholics and Orthodox speak of sacred tradition, they do not believe that God is still giving new revelation to the church. They do not believe the apostolic deposit is still growing. They do not believe new doctrines are being added to Christianity centuries after the apostles died. They don't believe any of those things. Rather, they believe that the apostolic deposit of faith was completed with Christ and his apostles, and that the church has faithfully preserved that deposit all throughout church history. And again, for the sake of this discussion, I am perfectly willing to grant all of that. In fact, the reason why I want to grant all of that is because I think it helps us to get to the real issue just much, much faster. You see, I want you to imagine for a moment that your boss, for example, gave you a complete set of instructions to your office before leaving for an extended period of time. And in this office, everyone agrees that the instructions are complete. Right? Everyone agrees that the boss isn't sending new instructions. Everyone agrees that the boss said whatever the boss said is binding on the employees. All right, so we have that picture set in our minds. Okay, so now allow me to ask you a very simple question. How do I know which instructions actually came from the boss? How do I identify which instructions genuinely belong to the original deposit that the boss actually left behind? Now, I know some of you are probably confused by now. You're probably wondering, why did I need to give you an analogy if what I just said essentially sounds like the very same question that I asked in one of my previous videos? And in one sense, I'm glad you picked up on that, because you're absolutely right. That is the very same question. But I actually just want you to roll with me for a moment, because I'm actually taking you on a journey, and I think you will begin to see why this analogy matters in just a few moments. Because if you're sensing that this sounds familiar, then that's actually the point, right? You see, this is where I think all of my previous questions are beginning to converge in on one central question. You see, the reason why Protestants keep asking questions like this, like what functionally distinguishes tradition from scripture, or where can I find the contents of sacred tradition? Well, the reason why we keep asking questions like this is because we're all trying to answer a much larger question. And that question is simply this: how do I identify what actually belongs to the apostolic deposit? But I actually want to return back to the analogy for a moment. You see, I want you to imagine that over time, various employees begin telling you that there are additional things that the boss supposedly taught. Now, I want you to notice what you're not doing in that moment, right? Notice how you're not assuming that anyone is lying. You're not accusing them of being wrong just because they said it. You're not even saying that the instructions that they're giving you are false. Rather, you're simply asking them, well, how do they know? How can you know and verify that those instructions that they're giving you genuinely came from the boss himself? Right. And so I want you to suppose you ask them for a complete list of those instructions. And then they respond to you by saying, well, I don't really have one. And it's like, okay, all right, no big deal. Then suppose you ask them where all of those instructions are maybe located. Maybe you can compile the list for yourself as long as you can find the data set. And again, they respond to you, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then you finally ask them, okay, can you at least give me some way of distinguishing the boss's original instructions from just later office customs that may have, possibly developed over time while he was gone? And then once again, they say the answer is no. Are you starting to sense the tension here? Do you see why that employee might begin to feel, a little bit uneasy? And, if you notice, that uneasiness doesn't come from some type of hatred for the boss or even his supervisors, right? It doesn't come from you wanting to be rebellious. It doesn't come from you wanting to refuse to listen to whoever is put in charge in the boss's absence. Rather, it comes from the fact that the employee genuinely wants to know what the boss actually said. Because as every employee can probably relate to, the very last thing that you want to be doing is following instructions that you never actually had to follow in the first place. We've all been there, right? Anybody who's had a job has been there, right? You probably had a supervisor at some point who tried to kind of smuggle in his own prefaces and alongside the boss's actual instructions that he left for that supervisor. And then later you found out that you never even had to do those things in the first place, right? How do we all feel at that point? We feel frustrated. We feel annoyed. And it's because we all know that that kind of thing can happen. right? We naturally sympathize with that employee who wants to get some clarity on these things, who maybe wants to verify these things. And my friends, that is where I think the tension begins to emerge for my Catholic and Orthodox friends as it relates to sacred tradition. You see, I and many other Protestants completely understand that Catholics and Orthodox tells us that the apostolic deposit is closed. We get that. Again, for the sake of this discussion, we are absolutely granting all of that. But I just need you to understand that if the deposit is closed while the contents remain difficult to identify, then from the outside looking in, it can kind of begin to feel like it's functionally open. And again, I want to be very, very clear and very, very careful here, because I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Catholics and Orthodox actually believe that they have some ongoing form of revelation. I'm not saying that they actually believe that the deposit is still actually growing. I know that they would explicitly reject both of those claims. Rather, what I am simply saying is that from the Protestant perspective, and pretty much anybody else who's not Catholic or Orthodox, I think you can understand how it can appear to everybody else that what you have is a functionally, and that's the key word there, a functionally open deposit, because the contents of that deposit often seem very, 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 very difficult to identify with any meaningful level of clarity, right? After all, if additional teachings continue being identified as belonging to the apostolic deposit, and if future clarifications continue telling us what does and does not belong to said apostolic deposit, then the question that naturally arises, and that really should come to no surprise to anyone involved in really thinking critically about these things, is, well, how do I distinguish between teachings that genuinely originated with the apostles and teachings that develop much later within the life of the church, right? How can I verify this? How can the ordinary Christian, right, verify something like this? Especially when you take into consideration that some of the teachings that are said to belong to the apostolic deposit were themselves debated among Christians all throughout church history, right? And so, as you can see, the concern for us is not that of rebellion or an unwillingness to submit to authority. Our concern is identification. We are simply trying to determine what actually belongs to the apostolic deposit in the first place. Because again, if a teaching is truly apostolic, then we want to believe it, right? As Protestants, we want to believe it. If a teaching genuinely comes from Christ and his apostles, then we would be the first ones to embrace it. But hopefully, by now, you can understand why a person would not simply want to accept just anything and everything as an apostolic teaching merely because someone or a group of people claims that it's apostolic. You see, from the Protestant perspective, we have the same mindset no matter who we're talking to. If someone comes to us and claims to possess a teaching that originates with Christ or his apostles, our initial posture is not hostility. It's actually openness combined with a bit of caution, right? We're willing to hear you out. We're willing to listen, to see what you have to say. We're willing to consider the evidence that you present to us, but we're also willing to ask some questions, right? We're going to ask for some further clarification. We're going to want to know how exactly this teaching is connected to the apostles themselves, because just like anyone else, we want to ensure that we're not just accepting something that only appears maybe apostolic because of its oldness, because of its ancient nature, but we want to accept it because it's truly apostolic, right? And I think that's very fair, very reasonable of an expectation, is it not? And so if those questions cannot be answered with any meaningful level of certainty, then I think hopefully you should be able to begin to understand the Protestant hesitation in embracing these teachings. Now, I know it will be at this point that many Catholics and Orthodox will probably respond to everything that I just said by appealing to something like doctrinal development. And honestly, I think that's a pretty fair response. In fact, I think this is actually probably the strongest response that Catholics and Orthodox can give to the concerns that I've been raising in this and the other two videos. And I think this is where the real conversation truly begins. Now, for those who may not know what Catholics and Orthodox mean when they appeal to something like doctrinal development, they usually mean something like this. And granted, different Catholic and Orthodox apologists may articulate it in slightly different ways, but generally speaking, the idea is that the deposit isn't growing, right? It isn't changing, and the church isn't adding any new revelation. Again, we already covered that in the beginning of this video. Rather, the church is simply coming to a much fuller understanding of the apostolic deposit over time, right? What may have started as a seed, to use a agricultural analogy, in the first century gradually blooms more fuller in later centuries. And you know what? I hear that. I can respect an argument like that. That's a much more thoughtful response than simply telling Protestants to, just trust the church, right? Just trust me, bro. Unfortunately, some of the more layman Catholic apologists or Catholic and Orthodox, maybe commoners, will say basically like, oh, you just got to trust the church. And I was like, that's not really a good answer. This is a much better answer. But at the same time, I think that answer naturally leads us to yet another question, right? Which is, how do we know whether a particular development genuinely belongs to the apostolic deposit, right? Because sure, something may have developed throughout church history, but that by itself doesn't really tell us whether the root, or perhaps more accurately speaking, the seed actually existed within the apostolic deposit itself. Do you see the problem, my friends? Now, before we even go any further, I know that there are probably some Catholics and Orthodox, listening right now who are already preparing another objection at this point. They're probably thinking something like, well, Janai, doesn't Protestantism do the exact same thing with justification by faith alone? After all, if you're going to question our understanding of doctrinal development, then we can just turn this all around and ask you where Luther's articulation of justification by faith alone is found in the 2nd century or the 3rd century or the 4th century. And honestly, I think that's a totally fair question. But I do think there's an important distinction that needs to be made here. You see, the Protestant claim regarding justification by faith alone is more like two employees standing in front of instructions that were already written on the wall by the boss, and now those two employees are debating what exactly those instructions mean. For example, Protestants aren't ultimately appealing to church history as the basis for their belief in justification by faith alone, right? We're not looking to Luther and being like, oh, because Luther said this, that's why we believe this. No. Rather, what we're pointing to is places like Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and we're arguing that justification by faith alone, or justification by faith apart from works, is present within the apostolic writings themselves. Now, a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian may very well disagree with that interpretation. And my friends, that's perfectly fine, right? We can have that discussion. We need to have that discussion. And frankly, I think that's the more important discussion to have. But I just want you to notice what kind of discussion we're actually having now, right? We're debating the meaning of instructions that everyone can already see. We're debating the interpretation of text that everyone already has access to. The disagreement is not whether the instructions exist. The disagreement is about what they mean. Because again, the boss already wrote them down on the wall. Right. And my friends, that's a very different kind of discussion than the one that we've been having in regard to sacred tradition. And actually, to maybe even add a little bit more clarification here, I think this is where the Apostle Paul actually gives us a very helpful example of what the seed form development should actually look like. You see, when Paul argues that the gospel was present in the Old Testament, I want you to notice how he doesn't merely tell people to just trust him. He doesn't simply say, well, the gospel is in there somewhere. Rather, he points churches to specific texts. He points to Abraham. He points to David. He points to Habakkuk. He points to Isaiah. In other words, Paul doesn't merely assert that the point that the seed existed. Rather, he shows us where in the Old Testament the seed existed. In fact, this is why when Paul preached the gospel to the Bereans, this is how they were able to search the scriptures, which for them was the Old Testament, to see whether or not the things that Paul was saying was true. Now, obviously, Paul understands those passages more fully in light of Christ than the original audience did. Right? We all would agree with that. And so there is certainly a sense in which Revelation unfolds throughout redemptive history. I'm not denying that. But I at least want you to notice that Paul can identify the source, right? He can point to the specific text to show where the seed is, right? He can point to the actual seed in the Old Testament. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind, because it helps us to illustrate what many Protestants mean when we're talking about true doctrinal development. Right? We're not saying that Christians never come to a much fuller understanding of biblical truths more fully over time. Of course they do. No one's denying that. Right? Take something like maybe the doctrine of the Trinity as an example, as a prime example, right? Rather, we're saying that when a doctrine develops, we should at least be able to identify the source from which that development grows, right? We should at least be able to point to this seed, because the question that I'm asking Catholics and Orthodox about sacred tradition isn't what does this teaching mean, right? I'm pretty sure many Catholics and Orthodox are brilliant minds. They could probably articulate their views with such precision, right? And so that's not really my concern. Rather, the question that I'm asking is, how do I identify that teaching, the seed of that teaching in the first place, right? Where is the seed? Notice how those are two completely different questions. And so going back to our office analogy, this isn't two employees arguing over the meaning of instructions that was written on the wall. Rather, this is two employees trying to determine whether a particular instruction actually came from the boss at all, right? And that's why I don't think these two distinctions, or two discussions rather, are quite parallel to each other. And so it seems to me that if Catholics and Orthodox are going to successfully avoid this perception that they possess a functionally open deposit, then what they'll need to do is begin presenting the seeds for the beliefs that they claim to belong to the original apostolic deposit, right? We need to know where exactly can we locate the apostolic source from which the given doctrine grows out of. Right? And I want to make sure that I clarify that question, because I don't want you to hear what I'm not asking, right? You see, I'm not asking why a doctrine wasn't fully articulated in the first century. I'm not asking why theological language becomes more precise over time. I'm not asking why Christians continue reflecting on the implications of what they believe. I'm not asking any of that. Rather, what I am asking is much simpler. How do I know that this particular development genuinely grows from apostolic teaching itself rather than later theological reflection? Now, honestly, I think that's probably a conversation that we need to set aside for another video, but I want you to start thinking about that question because it's important. Because once we start talking about seed form, we're now going to be talking about the nature of evidence. We're now going to be talking about methodology. We're now going to be talking about what counts as a legitimate development and what doesn't. And I think that's a much bigger discussion than I actually want to tackle in today's video. That's going to be a future video that's coming up pretty soon, but it's not a video that I want to tackle today. But I at least want you to see and understand at least how we arrived here. Because remember where we started, right? We started by asking what functionally distinguishes sacred tradition from sacred scripture. If both eventually end up written down and are infallible and have all of the different same qualities, right? Then we move to the location question, right? If sacred tradition exists, where can I actually find its contents, right? Are we done writing everything down, or is there still more that remains to be identified and to be documented, right? Which of course brings us to the question that we've been wrestling with today, because if you tell me that we're not done identifying the contents of sacred tradition, then we seem to run into this tension where we have a deposit that is claimed to be closed. Again, that's the official claim, but it can appear functionally open, right? Especially if we cannot identify its contents or its table of contents with any meaning level of clarity. And so at this point, I actually just want my Catholic and Orthodox listeners to just sit back and really think about everything that's transpired thus far. You see, I want you to notice what has happened, right? You see, every time that I continue to kind of pull on this thread, right, another question seems to emerge, right? And then every time that we ask that question, there seemed to be another question lurking right behind it, right? And that's really what I've been trying to help my Catholic and Orthodox friends understand throughout these series of videos. You see, at this point, we're no longer talking about a single unanswered question in regard to sacred tradition, right? If we were, I probably wouldn't be making that big of a deal out of it. Now, we're talking about a growing collection of unanswered questions that all seem connected to one another in one shape or form. And so, allow me to return back to the boss analogy one last time. Again, I want you to imagine if this happened to you in real life at your workspace. Imagine that your boss actually gave instructions before he probably went on PTO or something, right? He wrote down part of those instructions on maybe a piece of paper on the wall. And then he gave some additional instructions to you or to your supervisors orally. And again, everyone agrees those instructions are important. Everyone agrees those instructions are binding. Everyone agrees those instructions are necessary to understand. But the problem is that nobody can show you all of those oral instructions. Nobody can tell you where exactly they are. Nobody can clearly distinguish the boss's original instructions from later office customs. And worse, you have some employees disagreeing with one another about what actually belongs to those oral instructions and what doesn't. And so you come into this situation simply looking for clarity, simply trying to say, look, I don't want to do a bunch of extra work that I don't need to do. But it seems like every time you question, right, every question you ask not only fails to get answered by the supervisors or by whoever the case may be, but it actually starts to generate other questions, and then another question, and then another question. And my friends, I just want you to think about that for a moment. How would you feel if you was that employee? Would you start to feel completely confident in the employee's ability to retain those oral instructions, or would you begin to feel some tension and maybe hesitation? I think we all know the answer to that question. And maybe, just maybe, this is where we need to step out of the hypothetical for a moment so that my Catholics and Orthodox friends can truly feel the force of these questions, because I understand that many of them probably don't right now. And as I was thinking about this in preparation for this video, I think I understand why. It's because from their perspective, Christ made certain promises to his church, right? He promised that, for example, the Holy Spirit would guide his church. He promised that the apostles would be brought to remembrance concerning what he taught them. He promised that the gates of Hades would not ultimately prevail against the church, right? We know these things. And so it's because of those beliefs that many of these questions simply don't create the same level of concern that they create for Protestants. And honestly, if those promises actually meant what Catholics and Orthodox believe they mean, then I can kind of completely understand why those questions don't exactly carry the same weight for them. But here's another question. I know I asked probably 10 questions in this video, but here's another question that I think many Catholics and Orthodox have to still wrestle with. What if, and this is a big if, what if those promises don't actually mean what you think they mean? Now, I'm not going to argue about those passages here because, again, that's a conversation for another day. But I at least want you to see why that question matters. And I at least want you to start thinking about that question. Because if those passages don't actually teach what Catholics and Orthodox think they teach, then suddenly all of those unanswered questions that you keep putting in the back of your minds and telling yourself that they probably don't really matter to me because my church is protected, well, now they become incredibly important. In fact, they become some of the most important questions that we could possibly ask. And so, if the reason I should accept your church's interpretation of those passages is because your church says that those passages, that's what those passages mean, that your church says that that's what those passages mean, then it seems like we've now entered into a vicious circular argument that creates an entirely different set of problems. Now, I know the more thoughtful Catholic and Orthodox apologists wouldn't merely just say, oh, John 16 means this because my church says it means this. Usually they'll give a more exegetical argument for that. But I've noticed some Catholic and Orthodox actually do get that argument. And I want you to know that it actually creates a lot of problems, like a lot. And again, that's a conversation for yet another video. But for now, I think it suffices to say that we have a growing collection of unanswered questions that still need answers. And my hope is that by walking through some of those questions with you in an open forum like this, it would at least help you to understand why I continue to remain happily Protestant. Now, to be clear, these unanswered questions are not the only reason that I'm Protestant. I don't want you to get confused, but they are certainly one of the main reasons. And so, anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. I would genuinely love to hear my Catholic and Orthodox friends maybe try to answer some of these questions, right? I would love to engage with you in the comment section. Do me a favor, though, because it's a lot more people engaged in the comment section. Try to not have your comments be too lengthy. If you have to, I'll try to read through it all. But if you can, try to get as brief as possible, right? Because I genuinely want to engage in it. But if everybody's leaving kind of like books, it becomes very hard to prep for the next video and leave you a thoughtful response, right? But I do want to respond and engage with you in the comment section. Also, if this channel has helped you think through these types of issues, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, or even just Protestant, right? Maybe you're just like, you know what, Janai, I still don't agree with you in all of the different things that you've articulated in this video, but at least you did one thing. You helped me understand maybe a much better, thoughtful Protestant perspective on these things. I would still consider that to be a win, in my opinion. And so if I've helped you come to that realization, do me a favor, please consider liking, share, and subscribing, as it really does help out a lot. But until next time, guys, peace.